it's wonderful to be part of this NORFACE Governance, and I think this is a great research enterprise with these 14 projects, 180 people. It's quite amazing, and addressing some of the very fundamental questions facing European societies and democracies today. So I'm honored to be here, and I can see a lot of or some very well-known names in the audience. So thanks for being here, and some others I haven't met before. So thank you for joining. And I'll just start sharing my slides here, and make yeah. I hope you can see the slides by now, and also make clear that that the question, or the overall question guiding my presentation here will be the question: do political parties do anything good to public opinion? And I think that is indeed an important question to ask, not least in this context, because the point of departure of the democratic governance in a turbulent age of this NORFACE project is indeed focusing on some of the challenges that involves political parties in our democracies. And here I just cite some of the main motivations as point of departure for the overall NORFACE Governance project, that indeed democratic politics and governance in Europe are facing turbulent times. And one indicator of this is that the party systems have crumbled or been substantially changed by new parties, including populist ones, and new social movements. So there's a challenge to the established party systems. Also, the parties in power, both at the national and regional levels, have called into question some constitutional arrangements, challenging fundamental institutional aspects of democracy, and which is a further challenge, of course, and also some of these challenges we discuss here have in part resulted from the changes in the nature and form of citizen attachments to government and the political parties themselves. So there's a lot of focus on political parties in the overall problem definition of the NORFACE Governance project. And I think for obvious reasons, given that the political parties have been, since the beginning of representative democracy, a key linkage between citizens and the political system. And obviously many of these troubles or challenges can be seen as coming from the political parties themselves. So maybe the parties have not been strong enough to engage citizens, to mobilize citizens into democratic participation. Some new parties have formed and challenged established parties and using populist or even more extreme appeals, also putting strains on the legitimacy of the democratic representation. So I think in this context, it would be an obvious question to ask whether political parties do anything good to public opinion. And my focus is on public opinion as one aspect or one feature of the link between what citizens think, reason about politics, how citizens act towards politics, and then the political parties as the main linkage between the political system and citizens. And the question is, to what extent political parties still can play also a more constructive, a more positive role for public opinion. So that is the broad starting point. And as Jana said in the introduction, I'm working on this question in an ERC funded project, and here I would like to present an argument and some results from this project that I think would help shed light on at least an aspect of this question of whether political parties do anything good to public opinion. And so what I will focus on is a particular type of communication from political parties, namely communications or messages about the policy positions parties take in debates and in campaigns. So parties obviously propose policies, take positions pro or con various policy proposals. And in the literature on public opinion and political psychology, political communication, these type of messages are called party cues. So defined as pieces of information telling whether a political party is pro or con a given policy proposal. And I think that is a specific feature of party communications, of course, but it's also an important one because sort of a lot of the substance on politics is about the content of issues and the substantive solutions to problems are policy solutions. Parties propose to do something, parties oppose other parties' attempts to do something. And we know from a quite large literature that these cues can influence citizens' opinions. So people tend to take advice from their parties or follow their parties when forming opinions. But with this project and the argument I'm going to present here, we try to, at least our ambition is to suggest a new way of thinking about how citizens can rely on political parties to understand political issues, understand political substance. So we try to, what I would like to suggest to you is that political parties work this way to engage citizens in reasoning about policy issues that has not really been appreciated. And what we do with this project is really that we shift focus from parties influencing opinion to a much more fundamental, we think, but yet neglected feature of public opinion, namely citizens' policy inferences. That is, citizens' thoughts about what is the policy actually about, what is the consequences of a given policy. So it's really about to what extent parties influence how citizens grasp the meaning of policy issues like this healthcare proposal, this proposal to do something to counter climate change, this and various other policy proposals. How do citizens make sense of these often complicated issues? And this is a new way to think about the link between political parties and citizens, I think, because if you look at the existing literature, there's a predominant focus on policy opinion. And even if existing theoretical approaches focused on something beyond opinion, they would leave little room for policy inferences to matter. So that there's a big perspective coming from the American voter and later work for raising an identity-based perspective that citizens, essentially saying that citizens would take cues from parties, follow the parties' positions because they want to express who they are and signal a group loyalty. But that's a very different way of citizens relying on parties than what I would argue. So I would argue much more that citizens can actually use parties to figure out what is this issue about. And even the other major perspective, the shortcut or heuristic approach would say that citizens actually follow cues from parties to form an opinion as if they were informed, but not really to get informed. So citizens use party cues to avoid engaging policy substance. But I would like to argue the other way around, that citizens can actually use parties as a means to grasp what is substantively at stake here. And this idea is fundamental, this idea that citizens can use parties to grasp the substantive meaning of policy issues, because these policy inferences really are the foundation, not only for citizens forming opinions about policy issues in a substantive way, but they are also the foundation of citizens being able to engage in democracy in many other ways. So how can citizens understand what's going on in a policy debate without having at least a basic understanding of what will the consequences of the policies be that we talk about? How can people share their views on social media about new policies being proposed without being making reference at least to some substantive element of the policy, or which group will be implied here? So it's really a fundamental aspect, and also raising possibility or being the fundamental prerequisite for citizens being engaged with issues and discussing with each other. So at least citizens might disagree over policies, but at least they could maybe agree on what is the issue about. So what is their disagreement really about? So that's the point of departure. And the argument is essentially that we will propose a new way to think about how citizens use party cues to make sense of policy. And the key idea here is that how can citizens use a cue to make sense of policy? How can citizens use the source of the sponsor of a policy to learn more about the policy? Well, the key element is that you need to know something about the cue giver in advance. And without knowing something about the cue giver in advance, how can you use the cue for anything? And here, the political parties are particularly important as the long-standing actors in the democratic system, or at least even with new parties coming in, they would quickly become part of a partisan competition and be placed in connection or against other political parties. So citizens have a pretty a good grasp of what the parties typically stand for and what groups in society they represent. And we see this in many different types of empirical studies on party stereotypes, who belongs to the parties, on parties' ideological positions, on work on issue ownership, so which issues do parties care about in particular, and which constituencies do parties typically represent. So citizens have a pretty good sense of what the parties stand for in general. But we know very little about to what extent citizens use this well-established knowledge about the parties to actually interpret policy issues, or how do they use this to when they follow political debates. And here our argument simply is stated in these two hypotheses, that to the extent that parties have policy reputations, and they often have, citizens use party cues to infer the substantive content and consequences of the policy in line with the party's reputation. And they do that in two ways. So one way is to use the cue, the general reputation of the party, to fill in the blanks. So if you just get a glimpse of a policy proposal from a debate or in a headline in the news, citizens can figure out, this proposal from the Social Democrats probably will advance equality in healthcare, or probably would advance government regulation to protect the environment. At other times, maybe there's a lot or sufficient information, or maybe a lot of information, complex information. And here citizens can again use the reputations of the party to interpret and prioritize the information. So what aspect of the policy, this policy proposal, is really the most important aspect, or what is the key message of this policy? What is the main consequence this policy will have? So here we can think of a related concept from communication, the framing concept, and think that the cue could act like an emphasis frame. So the cue, because the parties has a reputation for caring about certain values or caring about certain groups, the cue can sort of frame the issue or tell what dimension of a complex set of information is the most essential here. So that's how I think parties can help citizens grasp the substantive meaning of policies. This would work better for some citizens than for other citizens. And since the whole idea here is that citizens need to know something in advance about the cue giver, we think that those more politically knowledgeable citizens will use cues to draw policy inferences to a larger extent than the less politically knowledgeable citizens, simply because you need to know something about the cue in advance to use it. Okay, let's move then to a test of this argument. How can we do that? And we propose a very simple design. So essentially, we conduct a survey among a group of citizens, and during this survey, we present a vignette with a description of a policy proposal. and then we vary which political party is endorsing this policy. And we only use real-world policy proposals that were actually endorsed by different parties, so by receiving bipartisan support. And so we can truthfully and without deception tell people about that the policy was sponsored by the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, for example. And then we develop a series of new measures to grasp citizens' policy inferences. So we need a new set of measures to go beyond existing literature that focuses mainly on opinions. So we need to develop a new set of measures of inferences. And in what I'm going to present here, we have done this, and this paper builds on work with my co-authors Rasmus Skytte and Martin Bisgaard here at Aarhus as well. And what we did was we conducted experiments in 2 countries. So we conducted experiments in Denmark, because that's a context we know well and can work with the parties. And we then conducted experiments in the United States, because it's not only a case that many in the literature would care about, but it's also a very different party system, a much more polarized 2-party system than the much more consensual multi-party system of Denmark. So we conducted 6 experiments on these issues, and the key idea here is that we use specific policy proposals and then selected party sponsors. In the US case, it was obvious, the Democrats and Republicans, but we selected party sponsors where we could, based on existing research and theoretical literature, we could think that the parties would have well-established policy reputations, and we could think what would then, given our theory, be the type of inferences respondents would make here. So, for example, we have in the United States a policy about regulating the use of HFC gases in manufacturing. So a policy that I'll show you in a minute, sponsored by either the Democrats or the Republicans. And given the different reputations of the parties, our hypothesis would imply that if this policy is presented by the Democrats, citizens would infer that the consequences of the policy would be to help the environment and combat climate change. Whereas if it was proposed by the Republicans, that it would be a more pro-business proposal that would reduce government regulation of businesses. So this is the logic. And here is an example of one of our vignettes on the HFC gas policy vignette. So we presented people with some knowledge details here. So we said that either Republicans or Democrats in Congress have proposed a law that regulates the use of HFC gases which contribute to global warming. HFC gases are used for many purposes, for instance, in refrigerators and fire extinguishers. Here are some of the items in the Republican proposal. And then we listed some policy elements, some policy details. For example, that HFC gases should, according to this proposal, should be phased down over the next 15 years, and that essential use of HFC gases would still be allowed, including in areas where companies cannot find alternatives, and also that the Environmental Protection Agency would be restricted in its ability to accelerate the phase down. And then something on what would this policy do to US trade balance. So again, this policy vignette is based on an actual policy proposal discussed in the US Congress and with bipartisan support, but we presented here as with either the Republicans or the Democrats as sponsor or in a control group without parties. Simply to test if people see different policies depending on the party sponsor. So do parties help citizens grasp or figure out what is this issue about? So the measures we use is both, first of all, an open-ended measure. So we just asked, what do you think is the purpose of the Republican proposal regarding HFC gases? Please list as many thoughts as you have, simply because we wanted to see how citizens in their own words describe the policy. But we also didn't want to sort of overemphasize the use of cues. So technically, while asking this open-ended question, we kept the policy vignette on the screen so people could use that information as they wanted. But we also asked some close-ended questions to be able to do some more simple quantitative comparisons across experimental conditions. So we developed sort of specific inference questions for each policy proposal. So in this case, on the HFC gases, we asked, do you think that the Republican proposal regarding, or the Democratic regarding HFC gases mainly aims to prevent climate change or mainly aims to protect US businesses? And then they could answer on a 5-point scale that it aims much more to prevent climate change, aims slightly more to prevent climate change, or that it would aim to do the same to both at the same extent, or that it aims slightly more to protect US businesses, or aims much more to protect US businesses. So that is one way of citizens to see if the citizens figure out what are actually the consequences of this policy. Another question was, do you think that the Republican proposal will increase or decrease government regulation on businesses? Another sort of New Deal conflict line between the parties, left and right. And finally, do you think that the Republican proposal will generally speed up or slow down the phase out of HFC gases? So various consequences citizens could think about differently. And to the extent previous literature or existing theories have even thought of these types of inferences, we would think that people don't really use cues to engage in thinking about policy substance. So we shouldn't see much of a difference here. But focusing first on the close-ended questions, here are the results. And you can see the dark gray dot to the left-hand side in the picture. That is the Republican Q experimental condition, and the light gray dot is the Democratic Q condition, and then the white dot is the no Q control group condition. And generally, what we see is that there are pretty substantial differences in the proportions or the percentages saying that this proposal aims to more at preventing climate change than it aims to help US businesses. So you can see that in the Democratic Q, nearly 50% would say it aims more to prevent climate change, and less than 25% that it aims at preventing climate change at the expense of businesses in the Republican Q. So a difference of 21 percentage points. Same thing with increasing government regulation of business. Many more think that the proposal will have as a consequence to regulate business in the Democratic condition than in the Republican condition. Again, around 20 percentage points difference. And people also think that if this proposal describes exactly the same way, but if it's sponsored by the Democrats, they think that the consequence will be a much quicker phase out of these HFC gases than if it's sponsored by the Republicans. So we see with these close-ended questions that citizens really interpret the policies differently and in line with the general reputations of the parties. But now I'll turn to showing the results of the open-ended answers. And of course, that's more complicated to analyze, but we opted for what I think is a very intuitive and very simple approach. So we simply compared the two experimental conditions, and then we used a text as data approach, and considering all words sort of independent, or like a bag of words approach, and we were looking at simply what are the words that are used most distinctively in the Democratic condition or in the Republican condition. So that is what you can see on the x-axis, that to the left in the figure, it's words used relatively more in the Republican condition as compared to the Democratic condition. And on the right-hand side of the figure, it shows the words used more in the Democratic condition as compared to the Republican condition. And then on the y-axis, you can see word frequency. And we have simply highlighted the 10 words used most frequently by, or the 10 words most distinctive of the two conditions as indicators of what are the words people write themselves when they are asked to describe this policy in an open-ended field in the survey. And what we can see is that the way citizens describe the policies are very much in line with what we should expect given the general reputations of the parties, and very consistent with what we found with the close-ended question. So we can see that in the democratic condition, people write that they think this policy is about, they write words like reduce and warming, global warming, and it's about change, it's about chemicals, atmosphere, ozone. So a lot of environmental considerations. Maybe reassuringly for face validity, they also write Democrats and democratic, which is reassuring that they describe the democratic policy. They notice the party sponsor of the policy. And very different in the Republican condition. Here we see people use words like business and produce, which is what we should expect given the general reputation of the Republican Party as free enterprise and pro-business. But we also see words like EPA, and we see words like years and long, and how can we interpret that? And I think again we should consistent with our theoretical argument that citizens can use cues to fill in the blanks if there's not a lot of information. But here we gave people deliberately a relatively long or medium long description of the policy to make sure that we didn't make them rely overly much on party cues, but gave them some substantive information to work with. And here we should expect citizens to use cues to really figure out what is this policy about. And if we go back and look at the vignette, we can see that that these words that I have highlighted here, the EPA and long and years, really refers to some of the less environmental elements in the proposal. So if you go back, and we can see that the first bullet point here is that the phase down of HFC gases will not happen right now, but will only be implemented over the next 15 years. So that's sort of not so pro-environmental after all. And also the last bullet point, the Environmental Protection Agency is restricted in its ability to accelerate the phase down, is also a less environmental element in the proposal, and that is so that might be what is reflected there in the open-ended responses. But sort of to get a bit closer to our interpretation of these keywords, so is this EPA or this years, is it really about citizens interpreting the policy as being less environmentalist, as I suggest? And to do that, we was probing deeper in our open-ended responses, and we simply looked at, again, we took, if you look at this table and look at the very leftist column, you see the 10 target words from before, and you see on the top 10 lines are the Republican words, or the words of the Republican condition. And here, if you see for example, in line 3, EPA, you can see the context of this word, and we simply looked at what is the most frequent word occurring together with EPA. What is the first most, second most, third most frequent words appearing in the open-ended responses? And you can see that next to EPA, it is accelerate. The EPA is restricted in its ability to accelerate the phase down or the phase out of this. So it seems like citizens really use the element in the focus on the less environmentalist element in the policy. And also, if you look at long, it says that it's long time, 15 years, and years, 15 years. So it's really, people are really focusing on these elements that seem to be consistent with the party reputation. So even though, to sort of repeat the main message here, even though people are presented with the very same policy vignette, and we only vary which party is sponsoring this, they appear to see two very different policies, and they use the party cues apparently to actively seek out and interpret what is this policy really about. Okay, I wanted to go into some detail with this as an example into this policy proposal. I won't, luckily for you, I won't go into details with the 5 other experiments we did. I just want to quickly jump over some other slides just to give you a visual glimpse of my claim here, or my statement that it is the results are extremely consistent across all 5 other issues, actually. So both the Danish and the other American one. So here we focus on a healthcare proposal. People see that in the democratic queue, it increases government regulation of healthcare much more, and it improves less resourceful recipients of healthcare. And we see the same. We see the same in the open-ended questions. Very distinctive responses. Turning to the 4 Danish experiments, we see again on our 3-4 policy-specific inference questions, big differences between 15, 20, 25 percentage points difference in the inferences, which are pretty large effects considering the typical effects you find in survey experiments. So we see this across these other issues as well. And then I'll just briefly show you results by political knowledge, because I think they are quite interesting as well. So our hypothesis was that because to use cues to make substantive inferences about a policy, you need to know something about the cue giver in advance. For that reason, we were expecting that the more politically aware, more politically knowledgeable citizens would make much more use of cues to make these substantive interpretations. And this is exactly what we see. So if we look at the HFC gas proposal, we can see that in the top panel of the figure, among the low knowledge respondents measured simply by factual knowledge questions, we see no difference at all. They don't make any difference between in their interpretation of the policy using these inference questions. We see some difference among those with medium knowledge, very much in line with what I described before among all. And among those high in knowledge, we see very big differences. So around 30 percentage points difference or more. And on the other healthcare issue, we see a very similar pattern. So no difference among low knowledge, more difference about medium knowledge, and big differences among the high knowledge questions. So, and we see actually the same thing in the open-ended responses. So you can't read the words here, but well, in the top panels, it's the low knowledge respondents, and in the bottom panels, it's the high knowledge respondents. And you can see that the high knowledge respondents write much more. They use much more distinctive words, and these distinctive words are used much more frequently and consistently. So again, using these open-ended responses across levels of knowledge indicates that citizens who know something in advance about the cue giver is also able to use this type of communication to make substantive inferences. Okay, to sum up, I think this shows that citizens use party cues to infer the substantive content of policies and its consequences, drawing on parties' policy reputations. And we found this very consistently across issues, parties, and 2 different countries. And we saw that the politically knowledgeable use party cues more. We actually also see, if we focus on various partisan groups, we see that Democrats and Republicans generally agree on which direction the policy would go, again suggesting that citizens can use party cues this way to create a joint common foundation for disagreeing. So people at least have, this is a very good point of departure for having a discussion about policies, that you actually can agree on what the policy will imply. And finally, and this is also part of the good news about parties, that even independents, those who do not belong to a party, can use the party cues to draw policy inferences, because this is not about following the cue of the party as an identity marker, or as just as a mindless shortcut to arrive at the right opinion. This is really about using what you know about parties to also make substantive inferences about policies. So, and this also has I think a major implication for how should we look at existing literature. So in the typical party queue experiment, people have sometimes used results that if a policy is sponsored by one party, citizens support that. Wow, people mindlessly follow that party, because if it was sponsored by a different policy, the very same people would be against the policy. But it might not be so blindly after all, because maybe citizens use parties to actually see different policies. So citizens use the parties to actually interpret the policy issues substantively. And that leads me to my final point, that that parties, given this, might play a much more constructive, or as I said in the title, a good role in public opinion formation, and much more so than current literature and also many commentators, pundits, debaters would suggest. So I think this is just sort of one aspect of how parties can do good to linking citizens to democratic discussion and engagement, but it's nevertheless an important aspect that has not been considered in previous literature, but which we think is a major element. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'll just unshare my screen, and I can get back with the slides if we need it. So thank you very much.